Fire crawled across the hull plating, and Thalkel could not make his hands stop shaking. Smoke filled the command deck in slow, drifting sheets, catching the emergency lighting and turning it the color of rust. Around him, control panels sparked and died one after another, like a row of candles going out in a wind he couldn't feel on his skin, but could feel all the same, somewhere under his ribs. He was still strapped to the command chair. He didn't remember sitting back down. He didn't remember much of the last 20 minutes at all. Only flashes, the deck tilting, someone screaming an order that didn't matter anymore. The sound a hull makes when it decides all at once that it isn't going to hold. In his helmet speaker, a voice looped, human, calm, almost gentle, the way a parent tells a child something the child already knows is true and has been avoiding. 212 years of warning, the voice said. This was the cost. Then silence. A long one. Long enough that Thalkel found himself leaning toward the speaker, waiting, the way you lean toward a door when you think someone might knock again. Then the loop started over. The same words, the same flat, unhurried delivery, as if the person who'd recorded it had somewhere else to be and no particular urgency about getting there. Thalkel had commanded warships for 380 years. He had watched enemies beg. He had watched enemies curse him, weep, offer him their children, their gods, their entire remaining fleets in exchange for a mercy he had never once been ordered to give. He had never, not once in 3 centuries of service, heard a defeated enemy sound so unbothered by its own victory. No warning shot after the fact. No demand for surrender. No boast, no threat. No promise of worse to come if the lesson wasn't learned. Just 12 words. Spoken once, and then that terrible, patient quiet at the end of them, as if the silence itself had been aimed at him specifically, the way a marksman aims not at the crowd, at the one man standing in it who mattered. Outside the shattered viewport, the wreckage of the Zarnothi Armada turned slowly in the black. Some of the ships still burned, trailing thin lines of flame that had nothing to feed on out here and would gutter out eventually, starved of air, indifferent to how long that took. Most of the ships had simply stopped moving, the way a body stops moving, not dramatically, not with any final gesture, just an absence where motion used to be. He counted 11 hulls before he made himself stop counting. There were more. He knew there were more. He didn't want the number in his head yet. Something was wrong with the display on the auxiliary panel too, the one that was supposed to be dead. The casualty count kept refreshing, climbing by 1s and 2s, even though the engagement had technically ended minutes ago. As if the humans were still out there, still watching, still adding names to a ledger that hadn't been asked for. As if they hadn't left the system at all. As if leaving had never been part of the plan, because the plan had never been about winning a battle. It had been about finishing a sentence that had started 2 centuries before he was born. He didn't understand yet what he was looking at. He would, before the day was over, and understanding it would be worse than the fire had been. I wish I could tell you it ended there. It didn't. Stay close. 9 hours earlier, none of this had seemed possible. None of it had seemed like anything at all. In the war room on Zarnoth Prime, where possibility had a very narrow definition, and had for 4,200 years. The room had been carved from black volcanic rock centuries before his birth, and it still smelled the way it always smelled before a campaign. Ozone from the display coils. Old iron from somewhere deeper in the stone. A smell he had come over a very long life. Warlord Vethkel stood at the center of the chamber with his hands clasped behind his back, studying a 14-meter sphere of cold blue light that hung in the air above the tactical table like a held breath, to associate with certainty. Some men needed music before a war. Vethkel needed this smell. It told him every time that he was standing exactly where he was supposed to stand. 9 fleet commanders stood arranged around the table in a loose crescent, the way they always stood, close enough to be seen listening and far enough back that none of them looked eager. Each of them had taken at least 3 worlds in his service. Each of them had learned, over years that would have felt like whole lifetimes to a shorter-lived species, exactly how long to wait after Vethkel finished a sentence before nodding, not too fast, which read as flattery, and not too slow, which read as doubt. The war room had seen 43 campaigns launched from its floor. It had never once seen a defeat announced from it. There was no ceremony for that. No one had ever needed to build one. Vethkel's 6 campaign scars caught the light of the display as he turned, 1 along his jaw, 2 across the ridge of his brow, 3 more disappearing under the collar of his armor, where only his closest officers had ever seen them. He touched his left shoulder without appearing to notice he was doing it, a habit older than most of the men in the room, a small private ritual that had outlived every war it had started before. Then he looked at the newest addition to the projection, a small, unremarkable cluster of worlds, tucked at the very edge of the charted galaxy, lit up in the pale amber that meant proposed, not yet claimed. Sector 9 Alpha. Human space. They have no fleet, said Commander Thalkel, standing at his right hand. He was younger than the others by at least a century, 380 years old, and had taken 9 worlds of his own, quietly, efficiently, without ever needing to be told twice. A scattered handful of colonies and a homeworld with less standing military than a Dominion border garrison. Then why, Vethkel said, not turning from the display, does the Thessary Elder keep warning us away from them? A side panel chimed, soft and polite. He said the words carefully now, the way a man says something he isn't entirely sure he wants to be true. No visible defenses, no allies that our scouts have found, the way it always chimed when the messages came from that particular source. A block of text scrolled across it, auto-translated into the Dominion tongue in a slightly stilted cadence that made it sound. Vithkel always thought, faintly apologetic, as if the machine itself were embarrassed to be delivering it again. Elder Eris Korvax, Transmission 48. Vithkel read it once, top to bottom, his eyes moving without hurry. Then he laughed, a short, dry sound with no real humor in it, more like a cough that had learned to imitate laughter after enough repetitions. 48, he said, and let the number sit there a moment, savoring how absurd it was. She has been warning us about Terra since before I was old enough to hold a blade. She warns about everything. She warned my father's fleet away from 3 worlds that turned out to be empty of anything worth fearing. She is an old woman who has mistaken caution for wisdom, and mistaken being ignored for being wrong. He waved a hand, and the message folded itself away into the side panel, gone. Set a course for Sector 9 Alpha. Full Armada. I want them pacified before the Conclave's next assembly, so that when the Elders ask what we have accomplished this cycle, I can tell them we have finally silenced the one voice that never stops talking. A ripple of quiet amusement went around the crescent of commanders. Not laughter. No one laughed before Vethkel did, but something close to it. Permission taken and gently used. Thalkel didn't move for a moment longer than the others. He was looking at the amber cluster of worlds, at the pale small dot that the display labeled, in smaller text than anything else on the board, Terra. Something about the smallness of the label bothered him in a way he couldn't have explained if asked, and no one was going to ask. Then he gave the order, because that was what he did, and the fleet began, deck by deck, system by system, the long, slow process of waking for war. 12 light-years away, beneath the Andes, Admiral Karina Vance was already awake. She had been awake, in the way that mattered, for most of her adult life. She sat alone in a room with no windows, in a chair that had been built for someone smaller than her, and that she had never bothered to have replaced, because replacing it would have meant admitting she planned to keep sitting in it. A leather journal lay open on the console in front of her, its pages soft and yellowed with 2 centuries of handling, the spine cracked in a specific place from where it had been opened, at the same angle, more times than anyone could count. She touched the spine before she read anything else on the page. She always did. It wasn't superstition, or she told herself it wasn't. It was a way of saying silently, to the people who had filled these pages before her, I'm still here. I still remember what you gave me. She had served the Earth Defense Command for 34 of those years, and in that time she had raised her voice exactly 4 times that she could recall, and regretted 3 of the 4. The first page, in handwriting she'd know anywhere even now, 30 years after her father had stopped being able to write it, said only, they will not believe us. We must be ready anyway. Vance was 58 years old. Her father had served in the first encounter, back when Earth had nothing to meet the sky with, but radio dishes and a handful of frightened engineers who had no idea in that first hour. Not because she'd been wrong, but because raising her voice had never once made anyone listen faster. That the signal they'd caught wasn't meant for them at all. It had been a stray transmission from a war 1,000 worlds away, a war that hadn't known Earth existed yet, and wouldn't, not really, for a long time after. She drank from a chipped ceramic mug, the chip along the rim worn smooth from age rather than sharp from breaking. The coffee inside had gone cold at least an hour ago. She didn't seem to notice, or didn't seem to mind noticing. Admiral, the voice came through the console, young and steady in a way that took effort to sound. Vance knew, because she remembered what 29 sounded like before it learned that trick. Lieutenant Santa Korvax, 8 years into a posting that mostly meant listening to a silence that never changed and reporting immediately, the one time it did. Sensor buoys in Sector 9 are picking up mass exit signatures, big ones, consistent with a full armada emerging from transit. Vance didn't look up right away. She finished the thought she'd been having, whatever it was, and only then set down her pen. How many ships? 1400. Best current estimate. Heading is confirmed within a narrow margin. They're coming here, Admiral. Not near here. Here. For a moment, nobody in the room said anything at all. It wasn't shock. Vance had rehearsed this moment, in one form or another, for longer than Santa had been alive. It was something closer to the stillness a person has right before they step off a height they've been standing near for a long time. The stillness of a decision that was actually made years ago, and is only now, finally, being carried out. "Get me Commander Korvax," Vance said finally, her voice exactly as even as it had been a minute before. "Tell him it's time." Commander Theron Korvax had been waiting for this specific call for 19 years, and he still felt his stomach drop when it finally came through. The way you feel a step that isn't there in the dark. He worked 2 levels below where his daughter believed he went every day, in a bunker with recycled air and lighting calibrated. Someone had told him once to reduce fatigue over long shifts, though he'd never felt anything but tired in it regardless. There was a photograph clipped to the edge of his console. His daughter, 9 years old, missing a front tooth, holding up a fish nearly as long as her forearm that everyone in the family knew, and no one ever said out loud she had not actually caught herself. He touched the frame once, straightened it a fraction of an inch that made no visible difference, and then put both hands flat on the panel in front of him, the way he did every time, a small ceremony of his own that he'd never told anyone about either. "Fresh old protocol," he said, and his voice didn't shake, though something under it did. "Authorization Vance Karina. Confirm." "Confirmed," said Vance's voice, coming from somewhere above him in the layered stack of the bunker. Calm as a Tuesday. Across 8-star systems, in the dark between worlds that had never once appeared on a civilian star chart, something old began, slowly, to wake up. Sergeant Corbin Voss felt it first as a hum through the floor of his battery post, on a moon that didn't officially have a name, only a designation number that nobody on station had used out loud in years. His father had served on this same rock 40 years earlier. Neither man had ever, in the entirety of his posting, fired a single shot in anger, and both had told Voss, more than once, over more than one drink, that they'd gone their whole careers half convinced the whole thing was theater, an elaborate. Voss watched the tactical display in front of him flicker once, twice, then steady into a soft green light, thousands of small markers waking one by one across the dark, spreading outward from some point past the edge of his own screen, like something enormous finally. His grandfather had served here 80 years before that, expensive ritual with nothing real behind it. After a very long sleep, deciding to turn over. "Well," he said quietly, to no one in particular, since there was no one else on shift to say it to. There it is. He had heard stories about the protocol his entire life, the way you hear stories about a grandparent's war, secondhand and slightly unbelievable. He had never quite believed, until this exact moment, that there would be this many lights. In the war room on Zarnoth Prime, none of that stillness had reached the fleet yet, and wouldn't for hours. Vithkel walked the length of the tactical table once more, hands still clasped behind his back, watching the amber cluster of Sector 9 Alpha shift, almost imperceptibly, toward the pale gold that meant in transit, committed. Thalkel fell into step half a pace behind him, close enough to speak without being overheard by the others. "The Elder's transmissions have never been wrong about the existence of a threat," he said carefully. "Only about its size. She has been wrong about its size for 4,000 years, Vithkel said, without heat, the way a man corrects a minor error in an otherwise pleasant conversation. "A species that cannot build a visible fleet is not hiding strength, Thalkel." He had fought 9 campaigns of his own, and he found himself thinking not for the first time that day that he had never once fought an enemy who had 200 years to prepare a single answer to a single question. It is hiding weakness, and hoping the hiding itself looks like strength from a distance. That is the oldest trick in every war ever fought, and it only works on someone who has never fought one. Thalkel said nothing to that, and had spent every one of those years preparing it in silence. He kept the thought to himself. There was no version of the war room where saying it out loud would have changed the order that had already been given. Behind them both, on the amber-turned gold display, 1,400 ships began, in perfect Dominion formation, the long, patient crossing toward a handful of worlds that had spent 2 centuries getting ready to be crossed. The green lights on Voss's display kept spreading long after he'd stopped watching them individually. By the time his relief came to check on him, unasked, the whole board had gone the soft, steady color of something fully awake and waiting. "Never seen it lit like this," his relief said. "Nobody has," Voss said. "That's kind of the point." In the bunker beneath the Andes, Vance closed the journal without reading further and set it beside the mug, spine facing her. the way she always left it when there was work to do that didn't need her father's handwriting to get through. "Time to intercept," she asked. 6 hours, 20 minutes at current speed. Santa answered. "They haven't changed course. They haven't slowed. They don't know too." Vance stood, smoothing a crease out of her uniform sleeve that wasn't really there. "Get me the Elder." A moment later, the console resolved into a different kind of stillness, the transmission delay of a signal crossing real distance, and on the other end of it, a face that had been old before Vance's grandmother was born. Elder Eris Korvax sat in a chair not unlike Vance's own, in a room lit by something that wasn't quite candlelight but did the same gentle, unhurried work. Behind her, a shelf held 47 small stone markers, each one a different color, each one representing a warning she had sent and watched land nowhere. "They are coming," Eris said. It wasn't a question. "They are." Vance allowed herself for exactly one breath, something close to an apology. "I'm sorry it took this long for anyone to listen to you. You listened 200 years ago," Eris said. "Before you were born. That is not late. That is early, by any measure that matters." She reached toward the shelf and touched the newest marker, the 47th, a pale gray stone that hadn't been there a day before. "I sent them one more warning this morning, not because I believed it would work, because the record should show I tried until the very end." "It'll show that," Vance said. "I'll make sure of it." The 47 words went out from Lieutenant Santa Korvax's station at 0412 hours, translated, compressed, sent on every frequency the Dominion fleet was known to monitor, and on several they didn't know humans had ever detected. "To the Zarnothi Dominion fleet, you are approaching human-claimed space. This is a final notification. You will not be allowed to pass. If you continue, you will be destroyed. This is not a threat. It is a statement of fact. You have been told what will happen. Every word of it." On the Dominion flagship, the message unspooled across a side panel in the same slightly apologetic translation cadence as always. Vithkel listened to it once. Then, because something about the flatness of it needled at him, he listened to it a second time. Arms folded, head tilted, the way a man listens to a joke he suspects he's supposed to find offensive rather than funny. He laughed on the second pass. "They threaten us with words," he said. "Pathetic. Maintain speed." Thalkel, standing near the edge of the display, did not laugh. He had noticed something Vithkel hadn't bothered to notice. The message hadn't asked for anything. It hadn't demanded a surrender or a tribute, or a withdrawal to some acceptable border. It had simply stated an outcome, the way a weather report states an outcome without any apparent interest in whether the listener believed it. Across the 8 systems the threshold protocol answered to. The platforms that had been quietly waiting under Corbin Voss's moon and 11,999 other patches of dark finished their long, silent calibration and went still again. He filed the thought away, the way he'd filed the last one, and said nothing. 6 hours became 4. 4 became 2, armed now instead of merely awake. Not one of them had ever fired outside a test range. All of them had been built, maintained, and replaced across 2 centuries by people who never expected to see them used and prepared them anyway. Because that was the only kind of preparation that ever actually mattered. Theron Korvax watched the readiness board turn from amber to a green so uniform it looked, for a strange half-second, like a single color rather than 12,000 separate ones. "Full array," he said. "Every buoy answering." "Copy," Vance said. "Hold position." "I don't expect they will." On the Zarnothi flagship's bridge, a junior sensor officer frowned at a reading that didn't match anything in the standard threat catalog. Faint energy signatures, thousands of them scattered across a volume of space that intelligence had marked, "Do not engage until the boundary is crossed. We give them every chance to turn around that the warning promised them." "They won't turn around," Theron said. It wasn't a question either. "No," Vance agreed, confidently, as empty. "Some kind of interference?" Vethkel said, when it was brought to him, barely glancing at the display. "System noise. Old debris fields hold charge sometimes. I want the first colony pacified within a day of arrival so the Elder can watch her precious warning amount to nothing at all." Thalkel looked once more at the strange scattered readings on the sensor officer's display before the man cleared them at his commander's order. "It happens near dead stars." He turned back to the tactical table, where the amber cluster of Sector 9 Alpha had gone almost entirely gold now, the color of a border about to be crossed for the last time as a border. 2 hours to the second boundary. Prepare the ground forces. And moved on to something else. He didn't say anything about it. There was by now a small and growing list of things he had decided not to say anything about. 63 years old, 31 of them spent in the archives beneath the Citadel, She was the only person alive who remembered the first encounter as something other than history. She had been a child then, 11 years old, and she still remembered. Vance stood alone for a moment in the corridor outside the command room, journal tucked under one arm, the chipped mug cold and forgotten on her console behind her. Dr. Anya Kalin found her there. With a clarity that never dulled, the exact sound the first Dominion scout ship had made passing low over her childhood home, a sound like the sky clearing its throat. "You remember what your father used to say," Kalin said. "He said it would feel like a debt finally being paid, and that debts don't feel good even when you're the one owed. Was he right?" Vance looked back toward the command room, where the readiness board glowed steady and green. It wasn't really a question either. Everyone who'd known Vance's father had heard it at least once. About the day this would come. He said it wouldn't feel like relief, Vance said. Where somewhere 12 light-years away 1,400 ships were closing the last of the distance between 2 centuries of patience and the moment that patience had been built for. "Ask me in 2 hours," she said, and went back inside. 2 hours became 40 minutes, then 20, then the strange, suspended stillness of a countdown with nothing left to count. The Zarnothi Armada crossed the second boundary at 0611 hours, exactly on schedule, exactly as the warning had said they would if they didn't stop. Vance said one word into the console. "Hold." 14 seconds passed. Nobody in the bunker moved, not because they'd been ordered to stay still, but because none of them could think of anything to do with their hands that wouldn't have felt disrespectful to the moment. Then, across 8 systems, 12,000 sensor buoys reported the same thing at once. Full lock, all platforms, single convergence point. Theron Korvax read the confirmation off his panel in a voice that came out steadier than he felt. "They're past the line, Admiral. There's no going back for them now." "There wasn't going to be," Vance said. "There hasn't been for 200 years. She looked at the readiness board, green and patient and utterly silent, the way it had been designed to be. It sounded like the whole ship had been struck by something with the patience of a glacier and the speed of nothing he had ever measured, a single fire when ready. On the Dominion flagship, Veth Kel was mid-sentence, telling Thalkel something about how the Elder would take the news of Terra's fall when the first kinetic round struck the outer hull. It didn't sound like an explosion. Enormous impact that traveled through the deck plating and up through the bones of everyone standing on it before the alarms even had time to register the damage. "Report," Veth Kel snapped, one hand already braced against the tactical table. "Multiple impacts," the sensor officer said, and his voice had gone thin. "Origin unknown. There's no visible launch platform, no ship signature, nothing on approach vectors. Then how are we being hit?" Veth Kel said, and for the first time all day, there was something under his voice that wasn't certainty. The truth was simpler and worse than anything on his threat catalog had prepared him for. There was no fleet to see, because the fleet had never been the weapon. 4,700 platforms, scattered across 8 systems for 2 centuries, had been waiting the entire time inside the very debris fields his own sensor officer had dismissed as harmless noise 9 hours earlier. 97% of their combined kinetic force converged now on a single point in space, his flagship, and the ships closest to it, with a precision that had nothing to do with luck and everything to do with 2 centuries spent calibrating exactly this moment. Thalkel felt the second impact through his boots before he heard it. He grabbed the edge of the tactical table as the deck tilted, watched 3 of the 9 fleet commanders who'd stood in this room that morning go down hard against a bulkhead, watched one of them not get back up. Around him, half the display had gone to warning red, ship icons blinking out of the formation one by one, not in the ragged pattern of a real battle, but in something closer to a countdown. "Countermeasures?" Veth Kel said. "Now, there's nothing to counter," the sensor officer said. "We can't target what we can't locate. Sir, the platforms. They're not moving. They don't need to move." They were already exactly where they needed to be. 9 minutes into the engagement, the flagship's primary drive core took a direct hit and went dark. The lights on the bridge dimmed to emergency amber, and for a moment the only sound was the low, mechanical groan of a ship trying to hold itself together around a wound it didn't have the parts left to fix. Thalkel looked at Veth Kel in that half-light and saw something he had never once seen on the warlord's face in 380 years of service, the particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic he already knows he's going to lose. By minute 11, the flagship had lost command of half its own formation. By minute 13, it had lost the rest, its communication array a smoking ruin, the 9 other captains who might have taken over the coordination scattered across a dozen different channels, each one making decisions alone, each one wrong in a slightly different way. Sergeant Corbin Voss watched the feed from his moon with his jaw tight and his hands still on the console, not because there was anything left for him to do. His battery had fired exactly once, on schedule. The remaining ships kept moving without a shepherd, still technically an armada, no longer functionally one, 1,400 hulls that had, for one catastrophic hour, no single voice telling them where to point their guns. And gone quiet again, but because it felt wrong to look away from something his father and grandfather had spent their whole careers waiting to see and never had. Granddad would have wanted a drink for this, he said to no one, and didn't reach for one. At the 70% mark of the engagement, with the flagship dead in the water and the rest of the Dominion fleet scattering in a dozen directions, Commander Thalkel did something none of the surviving officers on the bridge expected. He spoke, not to relay an order, not to report a status. He turned to Vethkel, in front of the two junior officers still at their stations, and said quietly enough that it barely carried over the groan of the dying ship around them. "You dismissed her 47 times, Vethkel didn't answer. He was watching the tactical display, where the number of active Dominion signatures kept falling, not in the ragged bursts of combat, but in a steady, almost gentle decline, like sand running out of something that had never been very full to begin with. We never once asked what it would look like if they'd had 2 centuries and nothing to spend it on, but this, it was the first time in the entire engagement that anyone had said out loud. She told us the size of it, Thalkel said. Not the shape. We assumed the shape. We assumed it would look like a fleet, because that's the only shape strength has ever taken for us. The thing every surviving officer on that bridge was already quietly beginning to understand. This had never been a battle they were unlucky to lose. It was a bill that had been calculated, itemized, and left unpaid for exactly as long as it took to accrue this much interest. Vance took the coffee from her mug and didn't drink it. She'd stopped noticing an hour ago that it was cold. "Status," she said. 847 confirmed destroyed, Santa reported. The rest are breaking formation and retreating. No return fire has been directed at any threshold platform in the last 6 minutes. They're not shooting back, Theron said from his station 2 levels down. They don't have anything left to shoot back with. Vance set the mug down, untouched, and looked, for a long moment, at nothing in particular, the wall in front of her console, blank and gray, the way it had been every day for 34 years. "Ceasefire," she said. "Let the ones who can still run, run. We were never trying to end them. We were only ever trying to be believed." She reached for the journal and touched the spine and didn't open it. The wreckage of the flagship turned slow circles in the dark, and Thalkel was still in the command chair, still strapped in, still shaking. When the transmission changed, it had looped the same 12 words for 6 hours. Now, without warning, a second line followed the first, spoken in the same unhurried, unbothered voice. "Your fleet was warned. Your leadership failed. This is the cost of ignoring a final notification." Thalkel sat with that for a long moment. Around him, the casualty count on the auxiliary display finally stopped climbing. 847. It held there, steady, complete, the way a number holds still once there's nothing left to add to it. He understood, now, what the climbing count had been. Not a threat. Not a taunt. A ledger, updated in real time, the way Elder Eris updated her shelf of markers 1 gray stone at a time. Proof kept for a record that would outlast everyone in this wreckage, including him. Vithkel was still on the bridge, pulled from beneath a collapsed support strut an hour earlier, his armor scorched along one side, his 6 scars nearly invisible now under new bruising. He hadn't spoken since the flagship's core went dark. He stood at the ruined tactical table, looking at nothing, the way a man looks at nothing when everything he's ever measured himself against has stopped being true in the span of 22 minutes. "Sir," Thalkel said, "there's a transmission, direct address. It's asking for you by name." Vithkel didn't move. Thalkel played it anyway. A woman's voice, unhurried, filled the ruined bridge. "Warlord Vithkel, 4,200 years, and this is the first war your Dominion has ever lost. You were warned 47 times by someone who never once raised her voice. You were warned a 48th time this morning, and you laughed at it. You were told the cost. You paid it in full." The transmission ended. There was a silence after it, deliberate and total, that stretched half a second longer than felt natural, the kind of silence that isn't empty, but placed. Vethkel heard that silence and understood, for the first time in his life, why humans did not shout. 14 days later, Thalkel stood before the Zarnothi High Council and played the recording once, start to finish, without commentary. No one interrupted him. No one, afterward, asked him to explain what it meant. 32 days after that, he played it again for the Galactic Conclave, in a chamber that had heard 4,000 years of Dominion victories announced from its floor, and had never, until that day, heard one of its defeats spoken aloud by the very commander who'd survived it. He was simply quietly, no longer asked to speak first in any room he entered, and within a year, the Dominion had begun, for the first time in its long history, sending scouts ahead of its fleets instead of after them, a change no one called cowardice. Vithkel was not tried. He was not executed, though everyone understood exactly where it had come from. In the bunker beneath the Andes, Vance sat with the charter open on her console for the first time since the engagement began. 47 signatures, 47 witnesses, 212 years of waiting, laid out in ink that had faded but never quite disappeared. All accounted for, she said, to no one in particular, and closed the file. Sana Korvax appeared in the doorway a moment later, her tea, as always, gone cold in her hand. Commander Korvax wants to know if you're heading home tonight. Tell him soon. Vance touched the journal's spine once the way she always did and didn't open it. There was nothing left in it that needed adding tonight. Someone else would write the next page, someday, when the next thing worth waiting 2 centuries for finally arrived. On a small, unremarkable moon that still didn't officially have a name, Corbin Voss sat at his post long after his shift had ended, watching the readiness board dim back down from green to its ordinary patient amber. He thought about his father, who had spent 40 years here and never fired a shot, and his grandfather, who had spent 80 and done the same, and wondered, not unkindly, what either of them would have said if they'd seen tonight. Probably nothing, he decided. Probably they'd have just sat with him a while, the way he was sitting now, and let the quiet be the whole conversation. At the very end of the transmission, after the 12 words and the silence that followed them, there was a small sound she hadn't noticed the first 18 times, a human voice, faint, off to one side of whatever room the recording had been made in, saying, Elder Aris Korvax listened to the recording for the 19th time, alone in her room lit by something that wasn't quite candlelight, her shelf of 47 stone markers, catching the glow the way old things do when they've finally stopped waiting to matter. Without any weight to it at all, get me another coffee. Aris smiled at that, small and private, the way you smile at something true. The humans had not enjoyed what they'd done tonight. They had simply done it, the way a debt gets paid, without pride, without apology, and without any further need to explain themselves to anyone who hadn't listened the first 47 times. She set the recording aside and reached, at last, for a 48th stone. She did not place it on the shelf with the others. She kept it in her hand.